What's up, Flannelverse? What's up, Endgamers? We are back for week 10 now. We're already to week 10. Thursday night football. We've got the Ravens and the Bengals. Should be a fun slate. Should be a high-scoring slate. A lot of chalk, strong options, but also some moving parts in this game. So it's, kind of the best kind of showdown slate where you're kind of expecting a fun game and also some uncertainty and where some usage is going. Adam, how you doing today?
Doing pretty well. Happy that we have an actual football game with two real NFL teams to talk about. I'm sure it'll go to shit because it's Thursday night, but at least for right now, it seems appealing.
You got a question already from Choke Hold'em. Asked, Adam, did you get to 38% Mayfield by sorting last Monday, or is that what came out of your sims?
I think the answer is kind of both. Like when I sort, it's still based on data that comes out of my sims. But I think it was a slate where I did what I was trying to do. It's always hard for me to remember because Showdown is the format where I'm like tinkering with my process and changing stuff most often. And so it has the highest percentage of, I just completely fucked up what I was doing and it's not what I wanted. I don't remember if that was the case last Monday. I know it was for sure the case last Sunday because I was still tilting the classic slate and ran out of time on Showdown. But for Monday, I think I was definitely trying something a little bit different. I think it was what I intended.
Yeah. Okay. I took down the Showdown slate, my first Showdown slate win this year. Yeah, it was the mini max. I turned $75 into $338. No, I'm making a joke because I was like, oh God, this is like finally get back into the win column. And it's when I decided to max out the mini max. And I 6x'd just a little bit more than 6x, which we talked about it on Monday. Like, okay, what's kind of the minimum threshold you'd be happy with? Obviously, not shooting for a 6x. You're going to lose money long term if you are playing lineups that 6x when they win. But whatever. I'll take the money. Also had a great night in terms of flash drafts. Made like $1,000 on flash drafts that night. So overall was a strong Monday night for me.
That is a lot more than I can say.
Yeah, would have been a lot better though if I had ended on that lineup in the flagship. Obviously, I mean, it's still like $20,000, like not the biggest win anyway, but would have preferred that. We before we get started on the slate, just wanted to note, right as we were getting on, Travis Petty just announced that he's retiring from NBA DFS, which is kind of crazy. He's been kind of on top of the NBA DFS game for a long time.
I missed what you said because I was pulling it up on YouTube and it wasn't muted, so all I heard was NBA DFS.
Oh, I said Travis Petty just announced that he is retiring from NBA DFS. It was like literally as we're coming on, just saw a tweet from Travis letting people know that he is retiring from NBA DFS. One of the maybe the best NBA DFS player of the past 10 years. So
I'm not upset to see that at all.
Yeah, that's so if you're thinking about getting into NBA DFS, now is the time. Getting Travis Petty out of those contests. Of course, my reaction to it, my only response was to at Brian Hooper and Pete Overzet so they can cover it on Lowell's later today in about an hour when they go on, half an hour, I guess.
I'd actually been thinking the other day, like I was working on NBA stuff, and a couple years ago I had put out just like a offer to side bet anybody in season long like flagship NBA results, and the only person that took it was Petty, and he kicked my ass. And so I was thinking about it the other day. I was like, I kind of want to do this again. Like it's fun. I was like, but the only action I'm going to get is Petty, and I don't want to just give Petty like $5,000 again. So I fell off. But I don't know. Maybe now.
if he's not putting in the 70 hours a week anymore, then maybe better. Chris, yes, any weather issues with tonight's game? And I always forget to check the weather, and that's I have to be reminded. So let me go check real quick for Christy, and then we're going to get into going position by position. While you guys are coming in, please.
Looks like it's supposed to be like 60s and clear here.
Okay, perfect. All right, so no weather issues expected.
That is not a Roth approved forecast. That is me just looking at the Baltimore weather on my phone.
Adam just looked outside and saw looks pretty good. All right, I'll pull up the Roth approved forecast, see if anything is going to change. Guessing no. He says, I won't rule out a drop or two of rain, but even that is fairly unlikely. It is a green situation, so no weather concerns from Kevin Roth. While you're coming in, please do like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you are in the Flannelverse, on the Flannelverse YouTube channel, make sure you go subscribe to the Endgame Syndicate YouTube channel as well. Adam does a lot of great content there. A lot of really, really sharp people at Endgame Syndicate doing great content throughout the week. And of course, the reverse is also true. I'd appreciate you guys subscribing to the Flannelverse if you are in the Endgame Syndicate. We are both trying to grow our small channel, so appreciate any support you can show us. But we're ready. We're ready to go position by position here, Adam. We're going to start with quarterbacks, and like we've said, fun game, fun quarterbacks. Got Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow on this one. Lamar Jackson coming in at 16.5% captain ownership. Joe Burrow coming in at 7% captain ownership. In the flex, we have Lamar Jackson coming in at 49% ownership. Joe Burrow coming in at 43% ownership. Starting wherever you want. How do any of those numbers stick out to you as numbers you think you're going to be well over or underweight on?
The Jackson captain ownership seems kind of low to me. I have it at like 17, 18% right now. I didn't catch you. You said around 17% too, I think. So,
yep.
Yeah, I've been kind of high on quarterbacks in general this year, but Lamar is the kind of quarterback that like I would actually want to be high on. He runs and then obviously is just really good overall. 17% just seems a little bit low. And I did actually have time before this show, since you were sleeping in, to run a set of lineups and kind of have a better idea of what I would actually be playing if the slate started right now, as opposed to just looking at optimal percentage versus ownership. And I do think he's going under-owned when you look at optimal percentage versus ownership, but also in a set of 150 lineups, if the slate started right now, I think I would have around 34, 35% Lamar at captain, which, again, you are still going to run into dupe issues because of him being relatively expensive and because of him being a quarterback. But the rushing upside does make it so you are able to get a little bit more creative, I think, in the ways that in who you pair with him. So that's going to limit the dupe issue a little bit compared to, statuesque pocket passers. So I'm getting to a ton of Lamar, and I am perfectly fine with that.
We got a question from Eli Case. Is this a slate where you can get away with not playing a quarterback? I feel like this is a tough one to try to not play
a quarterback, period. I think it's tough because of Lamar.
Yeah.
In a set of 150 lineups right now, Lamar would be in a total of like 87% of them. Burrow would be in like 60-ish%. Like, I think it's easier to get away from Burrow, given that he doesn't run a lot, and there's just a lot of ways around that. It's more difficult with Lamar. Like, I think if you went that route, you would just be saying, it's a Derrick Henry game basically, and then I don't know, going to like Bengals pass catchers too. But yeah, I think it's a pretty difficult one. It usually is when you have quarterbacks that are as good as Lamar, because raw points just end up mattering so much on a slate like this.
Yeah, and I agree. Like, sure, you can. Like, there are ways to build good lineups without having a quarterback in it. You can play it through like, the running games are just going to do well. PPR points are going to matter. Maybe it's a Thursday night game. Maybe it gets gross and they don't score as many points as we're expecting. So like, you can always, if you want to, get away from quarterbacks. But to me, this is a particularly tough one to get away because I'm expecting it to be a pretty high scoring game. The quarterbacks look awesome. Lamar runs a ton. So yes, you can. And I would guess in a 150 set, I'll have some lineups that don't have either quarterback. But it's a tougher one than usual.
I just looked, and in that 150 set, I would have one lineup that didn't have either quarterback at any position. And not surprisingly, it's a Derrick Henry captain lineup.
That makes sense. Yep. And just for reference, looking at schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed, this is a 4th best matchup for Joe Burrow and the Bengals, 5th best for Lamar Jackson and the Ravens. So it's just a great spot for both quarterbacks. And even better, like, you look at where the Bengals have allowed their schedule adjusted fantasy points, it's more through the rush than the pass. So it's a particularly great spot for a quarterback Lamar, and also for Joe Burrow. Baltimore giving up, they've actually allowed fewer than expected via the ground, but more than expected through the pass. So like, it plays to both of the quarterback strengths. Everything looks great for both of these quarterbacks. So yeah, you can, but it's a tough spot to get away from the quarterbacks, I think.
Yeah, and also sort of on top of that point, going back to just looking at optimal percentage versus ownership, I think Lamar, like I said, is going under-owned at captain. I think Burrow is going under-owned at flex. So even though they are relatively popular, they're not even really players that I would want to be getting away from. Like, obviously, you can make the raw ownership concern. They're going to be two of the most popular guys on the slate. But just from a chances of being optimal versus ownership standpoint, they're two of the guys that I'd want to get to the most, as long as I can still play lineups that I think aren't getting duped a billion times.
Yeah, exactly. As far as stacking goes, I'm treating Joe Burrow more or less just like a statuesque quarterback, where I'm always stacking him and multiple stacking partners when I have him in the captain spot, and Lamar Jackson, the exact opposite, where like, you can play him even in the captain spot without a stacking partner. I'd still probably prefer to have at least one stacking partner if I have Lamar at captain, but I don't think I'm going to force it in. I think I'll probably allow for no stacking options with Lamar when I have him at captain, because he does run enough. What are you seeing as far as your sims? Like how much are you getting to Ravens pass catchers when you have Lamar at captain, etc.?
Yeah, I see it pretty much the same way. Like kind of just scrolling through the lineups, where I do have Burrow at captain, which is a lot less often than Lamar. It's pretty heavily Bengal stacks, including Chase Brown, as an option there. But it's pretty heavy, 2, 3 Bengals in flex along with Burrow. Whereas with Lamar, it's a lot lighter. I mean, here's a Derrick Henry, Charlie Kolar team, so like no real pass catching options there at all. That one's a little bit heavier stack. Zay Flowers, Kolar, so that's 2. Like I'm still getting to a lot of 2 Ravens, but like here's one Lamar at captain with 5 Bengals at flex. Like that can very obviously still work out in certain situations. So I wouldn't expect to see something like that pretty much ever with Burrow, but with Lamar, I think you can get away with it here and there.
Yep. On Sandy Mass, you think we see both quarterbacks, Henry and Chase, can all get there? I mean, definitely they can. And if so, who's your favorite punt play? Well, I guess as we get into other positions, we will figure out favorite punt plays. I have some thoughts already, but we'll talk it through when we get to. I think it's mostly going to be receivers and tight ends is where we're going to find a lot of punt plays on this slate. As of right now, I don't know that I necessarily have a favorite. It might be Jermaine Burton if he's active, but we don't even know if he's going to be active. So we'll talk it through when we get to receivers and tight ends. But there are some pretty strong punt options on this slate. So you could.
Yeah, there's one I'm getting a lot of.
Interesting. I'll be curious to hear because there are moving parts, and like if you look around the industry at how things are being projected, it's wildly different depending on where you look. So yeah, we'll get into it at the other positions. I think that's all we need to say about quarterbacks. So let's move on and take a look at running backs on this slate. Derrick Henry, the highest projection on the slate. He's also 11,200. Pretty expensive. We have him at captain coming in at 11% ownership. In the flex, Derrick Henry coming in at 38% ownership. As far as schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed by the Bengals, not a great matchup for Derrick Henry, but he also is the type of running back, one of the few, like probably the least, sensitive to matchups running back in the NFL. He's just that good. I don't know, Adam, how much are you getting to Derrick Henry? How much do you want to get to Derrick Henry?
Yeah, so I'm not getting a ton, which is obviously really scary, but at the same time, like he's just so expensive. He's getting a lot of ownership, and he's not somebody that catches passes. And pass catching just gives you such a different floor when you are a running back. So like I like him here. The Ravens are at home. They're favored. Obviously, that's a really, really important thing for Derrick Henry is game script and how games go, more so for him than probably any other expensive running back. Usually when running backs are this expensive, they are guys that catch passes also. Henry is not. I think he's going over owned at captain. I have him at 16%. You said you have him at 11. I have 11% captain if the slate started right now. Where I'm really not getting to him a lot is at flex. I only have like 15%. Have him projected for like 37% flex ownership. And that is scary just because clearly he's one of the highest projected guys on the slate as far as raw points go. But I do think it kind of makes sense just going back to thinking about how he actually produces fantasy points. And, he could just run for 200 yards and, he scores 22 points or whatever, doesn't get into the end zone, doesn't catch any passes. But usually if you want Derrick Henry at 11-2, it's usually he like nuke the slate and you'd rather just have him at captain anyway. Like it's a lot of times, the 2 touchdown, 150-yard game. And if he does that, you don't want him at flex most likely, unless, somebody else just really goes crazy. So I do think that kind of handling it the way I did makes some sense logically, where I'm pretty much around the field at captain and then not getting to him as much at flex, given how expensive he is. But, really it's just, if you can make lineups that have Derrick Henry and you like them, clearly it's good. He's fantastic. The spot as far, not necessarily the matchup itself, but the spot as far as, being a home favorite serves him well. But at least right now, I am not getting to him as much. Like I'm prioritizing Jackson more. I'm prioritizing Burrow at flex more. I think I'm getting to more Chase. Yeah, I'm getting more Chase at captain. I'm getting a lot more Chase in general. So it's kind of just, for me at least, he's falling behind those other pay up options.
And I'm on the same page as you. Like he's not involved. And this is, we've seen this at least twice in like the past week, these running backs. So it's like, he's obviously a very good running back. it's a fine spot, but he's so expensive and not involved in the passing game. Like I can't remember who else we've seen, but we've seen multiple running backs, and it's kind of the same story with all of them. Derrick Henry is the one that I'm the most scared of as far as the fade for a really expensive running back who doesn't catch passes, like because it kind of feels like a spot where every sharp player is going to be kind of like best ball. Like most of the sharps were not super on the elite running backs, and they just shove it down our throat over and over. And it kind of feels like that's probably going to happen again, where every sharp analyst is going to be like, I'm going to be under the field on Derrick Henry, and then he is going to, as Anthony says, he's going to have 180 and 2 touchdowns at halftime and just like absolutely shove it down our throat. So I'm going to have some Derrick Henry, but yeah, I think an underweight position probably makes sense.
The problem, the scariest part, the problem you run into on a showdown slate is Levitan had posted this a couple weeks ago, and I kind of made fun of it, but he posted something basically showing just the raw points that Lamar has scored in each game and Derrick Henry, and said that they continue to have ceiling games together, when really Lamar was basically hitting median projection or slightly worse in games that Henry was having ceiling games and vice versa. But on a showdown slate, so like my takeaway for Classic was that he had it completely backwards, and you still don't really want to be playing those guys together. On a showdown slate, though, those raw points numbers actually really matter a lot, because you just don't have all of the alternatives that you do on a main slate where, if Henry goes for 28 points and Lamar goes for 23, you probably wanted a quarterback other than Lamar. On this slate, if it goes 28 Henry, 23 Lamar, which has been happening, relatively often, you probably still need both of them. And so the raw point total is what becomes really scary if you're fading Henry here.
Yeah, exactly. Like it wouldn't shock anybody if he gets the 100-yard bonus, gets a touchdown, gets 2 touchdowns. Like none of that will be shocking from Derrick Henry, but we only have 6 spots we can play. There are a lot of really strong plays and a lot of other plays in better spots. So it's going to be at least a light fade for me, but admittedly terrified of it because he obviously can shove it down our throats. Finishing out the Baltimore side of things, Justice Hill has been pretty strong option throughout the year. He is kind of if the game script goes the Bengals way and the Bengals are playing from ahead, suddenly Justice Hill is going to look pretty good. Here, I should pull up the ownership for Hill. Probably not getting into much at captain, but at flex, we have Justice Hill coming in at 18% projected ownership. That's one that I like. I'm sort of hesitant. Like I listed him as like the player that I'm most likely to come in underweight to the field, but I don't really feel that good about it. I don't know. The price is kind of right for a player that has some standalone value and obviously has continued value as well. So I don't really know what I want to do with Justice Hill. Where are you going there?
Yeah, I have like 9 to 10% at flex right now. The ownership projection I used for him is a little bit lower too at 13%. So I'm not too far off the field on the ownership projection that I used. I think he's just like correctly priced at this point, though. He's somebody that I've liked in Ravens showdown games earlier this year when he was cheaper, because he does have a clear cut role in this offense as the hurry up guy and as the third down guy. And like you were saying, if this game just goes differently and the Bengals are playing from ahead, Justice Hill is just going to be more involved. There's no real question about that. It's not like, oh, well, sometimes he's the passing down back, sometimes it's Derrick Henry. It is Justice Hill. So he has that clear role. But earlier this year, he was, 3K, 4,400, stuff like that, and not really getting much ownership. Now he's 5,200, and the ownership is slightly elevated, at least in that like 15% range, we'll call it, because everybody, we're in what, week 9, week 10, whatever it is. Everybody's comfortable now that Justice Hill has this role. It is a very clearly defined role. Whereas earlier in the season, you had that uncertainty of this is how, the Titans use Derrick Henry, but what are the Ravens going to do? And is Justice Hill going to be that guy and all of that? It's very clear that that's the case now. So people are more comfortable playing him at a higher price tag and more ownership. And it kind of just, moves things back to an equilibrium where I don't think there's a huge advantage in like fading Justice Hill, and I don't think there's a huge advantage in playing him. Somebody mentioned Keaton Mitchell potentially taking stuff away from Justice Hill. I doubt it. Justice Hill's been really good in this role, and if Keaton Mitchell is activated, it's his first game back. But at the same time, just from like a volatility standpoint, having another running back that maybe is involved certainly isn't a good thing.
Yeah, I think that it's there's no guarantee that he is out there. I actually, so I'll read the coach speak because it is sort of interesting. So this is from 3 days ago. Head coach John Harbaugh said, "When Keaton Mitchell is ready to go, I promise you he'll definitely be out there. Whether you believe that or not is like, what does that mean? 1 or 2 snaps, or is he going to really eat into that role for Justice Hill? Unclear." He says there's a chance he'll play Thursday. My guess is still that Keaton Mitchell is inactive tonight, but I guess we don't really know. So he could eat into it a little bit, and that would obviously suck. And I guess it wouldn't for us because it sounds like you and I are both probably going to be a little bit underweight to the field on Justice Hill anyway. In which case, good if he eats into it. But yeah, it's sort of there are so many sort of ambiguous situations on this slate, and that's honestly one that I've given the least thought to because it's the most like. We just like it's impossible to know whether Keaton Mitchell is going to play much, but the coach speak says yes, he'll be out there if he is active tonight, but it's up in the air whether he is active and who knows how much he's going to be out there. So yeah, it's possible, but I don't think 2 to 3 snaps that could be right. Like it might not be a ton, but hard to know. The coach speak doesn't really give us much of an indication. Oh hell yeah! Jacob says I won $13,000 off $15 on Monday night because you liked Hopkins at captain. I went with it. That's awesome to hear. Congrats, Jacob. Yeah, it was a good night on Monday with DeAndre Hopkins doing well. All right. Anything? Do you have interest in Keaton Mitchell if he is active? I don't even know what his price tag is because I guess I've been sort of working
like
under
200 or something. He's really cheap.
At 200, almost like he was really good when he played, like really efficient.
Oh, sorry, 24.
Oh, 2,400 is a lot tougher. I mean, it's still plausible.
And also just the one thing I want to point out is if he does have some sort of role and he's on the field, it again doesn't have to be from Justice Hill. Like obviously the assumption is that like you're not taking work away from Derrick Henry, but you have to keep in mind the specific skill set that Justice Hill has that pushes him into that third down role. And part of it is pass blocking. And I just pulled up the PFF grades from last year. Keaton Mitchell graded out as the worst running back pass blocker on the Ravens of all 7 guys that they used at different times. So like, could he be out there for a couple snaps that would normally be Justice Hill? Sure. But it's just not as simple as saying Derrick Henry, really good, Justice Hill, not as good. Keaton Mitchell replaces Justice Hill. Like that specific skill set that Justice Hill has he's much better at it than Keaton Mitchell is.
Yeah, that's a good note. And like, they might not want to keep running Derrick Henry 25 times a game. Like even though like obviously he has the talent, like they might want they're a playoff team. They should be taking a shot at Super Bowl. So if they can find ways to limit Derrick Henry's workload, that would also make some sense. So yeah, it's just it's a tough situation. No, not EOM says beats are saying Mitchell expected to be active. So yeah, I guess but 2,400 still not like. I don't think I get to a ton of Keaton Mitchell because we have a lot of good value.
And it's tough to get to. One other point in the Justice Hill conversation, as far as Mitchell not necessarily being a big downgrade, is when you're talking about hurry up offense specifically, you're not really subbing all that much. Like, if there's less than 2 minutes in the half and they don't have any timeouts, they're kind of just getting to the line and going again, and Justice Hill staying on the field. So, I think it all just kind of goes back to my initial take that like if Mitchell is active, it adds a little bit of extra volatility to both Derrick Henry and Justice Hill, but I don't think it's like a clear cut, he's taking anything away from either of them in any sort of like large sample. It's more likely he's just on the field for a few plays and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. The other side, Chase Brown, 27 carries, as I recall last week. He's 9,000. I don't think the matchup is particularly great against Baltimore, but let me pull that up. Yeah, it's like a below average matchup, but not by a ton. Actually above average for receiving work for running backs. As you can see here, plus 1.9 fantasy points per game through receiving work, but negative 2.8 on the ground. Chase Brown kind of, does both. So I don't know if I think it's just kind of a slightly bad matchup for Chase Brown, not the worst out there. He's 9,000. Again, he did 27 carries last week and 5 targets, and the route participation. All of his work last week were season highs. So, it looked really good with Zach Moss out last week. The role sounds like Khalil Herbert is going to be active tonight. I think I saw a beat saying that he's going to be active tonight. Who knows how much of a role he's going to have. So let's start with Chase Brown. Chase Brown coming in 37% in the flex. Captain coming in at 9%. Adam, what are you getting to relative to those numbers?
Pretty close to the field, like 10, 11% Chase Brown at captain for me, around 40% at flex. I'm not overly concerned about Khalil Herbert in this game since it is the short week. They said that he really worked his ass off to get caught up to speed. But like somebody asked earlier, could Herbert steal goal line work? Absolutely. Like that is probably like the easiest spot to see him stepping in and having a role. Ideally, I would think that the Bengals would like him on the field on third downs because Chase Brown is such a terrible pass blocker and Khalil Herbert in the past has been solid. But I don't know that that's something that immediately happens because that seems like the kind of thing that you're really trusting somebody not to get Joe Burrow killed that has had like 3 minutes or 3 days to look at your playbook. That, I think is something that probably takes a little bit more time if that is his eventual role for him to step into. So I think overall the workload for Chase Brown should still be good in this one. I would have concerns about exactly how they, goal line work goes, but it's not like it's a guarantee that it's not like they are actively looking to replace Chase Brown around the goal line. Like he's been a very effective runner this year. So I could see Herbert, stealing a touchdown, but I don't think it's a case where like they just acquired this guy and they're just super excited to have him take touchdowns away from Chase Brown. Like there's no need for that. So I think that it does sort of just add more volatility to Chase Brown because we don't know exactly what this is going to look like. But I do like, if you agree with my assumption, I feel relatively comfortable that you're not going to see Brown lose a whole lot of work in the most obvious place because I just doubt that Herbert's really completely caught up anyway.
Yeah. So the coach speak there has been like, we'd like to limit the usage of Chase Brown, like we're concerned about wear and tear. We want to get other backs involved. But also, like you say, like, I don't think it's necessarily likely to happen tonight because he just has not been, Khalil Herbert has not been on the team. He's only been there a few days. They say, I think Khalil Herbert can help us in a lot of different ways. Excited to add him to the mix. He's a good production in the run game. He's an able and willing protector. On whether Herbert could play Thursday night, I wouldn't take it off the table. Now it sounds like he is pretty likely to play. But yeah, it's tonight, the first game with the team after just joining this week. I don't think they're likely to give a ton of work to Khalil Herbert. I hope they do. He's my highest owned best ball player. So I'm really hopeful that they do run Khalil Herbert out there a lot, but it would be kind of surprising to me. So, so as far as Chase Brown goes, I think these numbers look fine. Like, I don't think that I'm getting too far away from 9% in the captain. And then what was it? 30 some in the flex. 37% in the flex. My guess is like light fade for me, but not, I don't even know if I mean that. Like, he's coming in under 50% owned. Feels about right. What are you getting to?
Yeah, I'm right around the field too. I think the ownership's pretty much right. One other thing to like from last week, and I hadn't actually looked, I just pulled it up just now. I mentioned that the most obvious spot for Chase Brown to lose snaps is in the passing game, like we were seeing earlier in the year. And, once Herbert is caught up on pass pro in this offense, you could see that. It is reason for optimism with Brown, though, that Travion Williams only played like 5 snaps last week. Williams did grade out as a better pass blocker than him last year when he got opportunities. So I did think that there was a chance you would see last week that Brown just kind of kept that first and second down role and Williams stepped in as a third down back for his pass blocking ability. We didn't see that. So they're at least somewhat comfortable, I guess, with Chase Brown just being on the field every play. So that, at least for one more week, I think is relatively likely to happen. And he's not super expensive. 9K isn't cheap, but there is a pretty nice gap in salary between him and that next tier with Henry, Burrow, Jackson, and Chase. So that's another reason I think he just ends up being pretty easy to get into lineups. And I'm right around the field, both at captain and at flex.
And as you can see here, the carries throughout the year have just been, it's like low, and then it came up and he was, kind of mid-teens, and then just spiked up to 27 last week with Zach Moss. So they clearly, trust him out there that much. Although, as I said, the coach speak has been like, we don't really want to be giving him that much work. We're concerned about wear and tear. But 51% route participation last week without Zach Moss, that was a season high. 5 targets was a season high. So the usage last week was awesome. He'll probably be, I would be pretty surprised if he gets 27 carries and 5 targets again. Like, that's just kind of crazy high usage regardless. But they seem comfortable with it. So maybe in the right game script, it could happen. But yeah, I think the ownership is ultimately pretty fair there. Outside of Chase Brown, Travion Williams is who Fantasy Points is projecting for more fantasy points of the backup running backs. Travion Williams, 2,000, Khalil Herbert, 2,800. Where does RotoGrinders have it? I'm kind of curious because I'm not sure if that's how I would have it. RotoGrinders has it Travion Williams 2.6 and Khalil Herbert 1.5. I don't know. It's interesting because on the one hand, Travion Williams was already there, knows the playbook, all of that. But on the other hand, we already know that they don't really want to give him a ton of work. So like, whereas Khalil Herbert, like maybe they would trust him a little bit more and he might have some more standalone value. Do you think you're going to get too much of either of Travion Williams or Khalil Herbert though?
No, I don't have any right now. I could see maybe getting to some Herbert. Like, that's something that I think could change for me. It's easier to envision Herbert just having this like small set of plays and roll that again is like just a short yardage package maybe and gets him in the end zone. Whereas like if they're not going to just give Travion Williams by design a bunch of goal line carries, like maybe he ends up randomly being on the field and gets one. But like when you think about if they go into this game with a specific just idea of how to use Herbert, there's a pretty good chance that it's like, hey, learn these 5 plays that involve you just like diving into the line from 2 yards out. And so like, you could kind of see that, but it also goes back to the conversation we've had on previous shows where, this slate is a little bit different because you do have such good players and they're somewhat expensive, but that the value in the relatively cheap guy that scores 7 points isn't there as much this season as it has been in the past because pricing at the top end is just softer.
Yeah, exactly. So even if he does score a random touchdown, and he's also not 200, he's 2,800. So it's tough to get a lot of either of them. I'll probably sprinkle in a 150 max, and maybe my mind changes by tonight. But as of right now, I don't think I'm going to get to really much of either. Obviously, the contingent upside is there, and that's really what it comes down to: is who would have the contingent upside if something were to happen to Chase Brown? Would it be Khalil Herbert or Travion Williams? And maybe it would be Travion Williams just because he does know the whole playbook. But I don't know.
I assume they would split.
Yeah, that might be correct. They might just split.
One other thing kind of holding back too much interest in gambling on either of those guys at their respective salaries is that you do actually have a relatively deep slate in that price range.
Yeah.
Obviously you can argue about who you like the most, but like Charlie Kohler, sub 1K, Tanner Hudson, 1,600, Trenton Irwin's 1,200, Jermaine Burton's 2,200, Aguilar's 3K. I mean, these are all, Samples 2,600. Like these are all just like viable guys that are cheap. And so it's not a slate where you're looking and saying, man, there's these expensive guys I want to get to, and there's nobody cheap that I can even envision doing well, except for Khalil Herbert maybe scores a touchdown. Like there's a bunch of guys that could do fine.
Adam, before we started the show, I asked you if we could start late, and then I said we can try and keep it short if we want. And now we're over half an hour in, and we're still at running backs. Yeah. So if we need to hurry, we can. But
yeah. There's no rush on my end.
Okay, cool. I think that's it for running backs. As far as schedule adjusted, we took a brief look at it, but I'll just read off my note from my article. The Ravens defense has allowed the 13th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to running backs, but the 6th most through the air. So maybe a better matchup for Chase Brown to get a few extra targets. And then I said the Bengals defense has allowed the 7th fewest schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to running backs, but the 14th most on the ground. So again, it's like the schedule adjusted stuff kind of benefits the prototypes of the players we have. Both the quarterbacks and the running backs sort of benefit from their specific style of play, but still not like great matchups for the running backs. All right, let's move on and talk about receivers. And it's all going to start with Ja'Marr Chase. And we've got some questions about Zay Flowers, and I will get to those. I think Jake did a good job already in chat of answering the question on Zay Flowers. But we'll start with the Bengals side of things because Ja'Marr Chase, obviously the highest projection on the slate, projects really well. He is 10,800. It is a great matchup for wide receivers. It's the best matchup possible against Baltimore this year. Over 10 fantasy points over expectation in terms of schedule adjusted fantasy points per game allowed. Ja'Marr Chase coming in the flex 41% ownership, at captain coming in at 17.5% ownership. How do you feel about those numbers, Adam?
I like Chase quite a bit. I have him in 21% captain. It's my second highest owned captain behind Lamar. I have him in flex at like 41%. So obviously going to be popular, but I think the field's ownership is pretty much right. And right now I have him projected for like 14% captain ownership. So I'm actually over the field on that. Good matchup. The Ravens have struggled in the secondary all season long. White isn't going to be active this week. So you haven't seen, you're not going to see all their upgrades this week that they attempted to make at the deadline. And then Chase, obviously really, really good. One negative is that, Higgins being out has just slowed this offense in general. It clearly takes, a top end pass catcher away. And I think increases the ceiling for Ja'Marr Chase just because it makes it easier for him to just, get peppered and get, 25 targets in a game or something. But it also affects the efficiency of this offense because they haven't had anybody else able to step up. They were hoping last week it would be Burton, and Burton just said, fuck that. So, that is a concern is, the opportunities are going to be there for Chase, but it's been it's been easier for defenses to key in on not letting him be as efficient. Still comes with a ton of touchdown upside, and it's a good matchup and all of that. But I do think, we've seen enough games without Higgins now where it's like, yeah, Chase is really good, but this isn't just a like plug and play. Jamar Chase is better because T. Higgins is out type thing.
Yeah, it's true. Like early, I mean, they've just been doubling Jamar Chase always. The most promising trend there is over the past 2 weeks, he has been targeted 22 times. So at least in the most recent games without T. Higgins, the targets have come up quite a bit. But yeah, has not really been getting crazy high volume throughout the year. But again, Ravens defense allowed the most scheduled fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That seems pretty good. Yeah, I think I'm with you. Like probably going to be right with the field there. It looks like he's obviously a strong play, getting a reasonable amount of ownership. Like he's not going crazy high owned, like over owned. So not much else to say about Jamar Chase. Let's move on to the other wide receivers because I think they're more interesting. Like Jamar Chase, just like everybody knows what he is. Like he's obviously, if he goes, he could have a huge game. Doesn't always, but I think that we need to talk more about the backup Bengals wide receivers because again, T. Higgins is out. Andre Yoshivas is 3,400. Projects fine for a $3,400 wide receiver. We'll start there with Yoshivas coming in at 21% ownership in the flex. I did know he has slightly better usage without T. Higgins. I wasn't even sure if that was going to be the case, but I did look at the difference with and without T. Higgins because I thought it was interesting. We have a large enough sample size in games with Higgins, and it's 5 games with Higgins. He has 14 targets, 71.9% route participation. 4 games without Higgins, 16 targets, 85.4% route participation. So more targets in 4 games without T. Higgins than 5 games with T. Higgins. So obviously that helps a little bit with Andre Yoshivas. He's also scored, like for whatever reason, they targeted more in the end zone. I don't know. He seems like a pretty strong play, but not somebody I'm going to be going crazy high over 21%, I don't think.
One more thing I wanted to add on Chase. I didn't have it in front of me at the time.
Yeah.
But in the games without Higgins, and it just, illustrates the point that we were making. In the games without Higgins this year, 0.22 targets per route run, 1.3 yards per route run. In the games with Higgins, 0.21 targets per route run, so basically the same, 3.06 yards per route run. So, obviously talking small samples in both situations, but he's been just way more productive per route when Higgins has been out there. As far as Yoshivas goes, I think, yeah, he's fine. He's 3,400. He hasn't stepped up and been good like people thought he was going to be coming into this season, but the opportunities are there. The very obvious question mark and concern is, what does the offense actually look like if Jermaine Burton is active? It sounded like they planned on him having a big role last week. It looked like he was going to have a big role based on the way, the opportunities he had in week 8, whatever the week before last week was. So I think you could kind of just see him step up and take opportunities away where, Yoshi's been on the field a lot, but he hasn't been super effective. Burton, from a talent standpoint, probably is their second best receiver behind Chase. It's just a matter of, do they trust him to go out there and do his job? And if the answer is yes, then he could just be a problem. If the answer is no, which it has been for most of the year, then you probably just continue to see the status quo and you see Yoshi used the way that he has been, which at 3,400 is fine. Like, he's going to run a lot of routes. He's not going to get a lot of targets because he's not very good, but they have used him around the goal line, which is nice. So as is, the way I have it projected right now, I'm getting to him like 29% at flex, which would be a little bit over the field. At captain, I have him like 1% of the time, but I do think that flex ownership could come down a little bit too, because I only have him projected for 16%, whereas you said you had 21. Based on how often I think he's optimal, I think 21 is likely to be more correct. It is more likely to be correct because I have him being optimal like 20%. So if I'd run this stuff with him at 21% ownership instead of 16, I probably would have ended up with like, 21, 22% instead of 29.
Yep, that makes sense. Jermaine Burton. So let's get into it with Jermaine Burton, because I think he is the big question mark on the slate. And again, there are places that don't even have him projected. Actually, I think Fantasy Points may have not had him projected yesterday. Now they have moved him in there. I might be wrong about that. They may have had him all along. Does Roto-Grinders have him? Maybe they don't. There was somebody I was looking at yesterday, and I was like, I can't even like use this. Looks like Roto-Grinders does not have Jermaine Burton in right now. So that's obviously going to change if he is active. But it's a mess, the situation with Jermaine Burton. And as you said, we look at his participation over the weeks, up to 42.5% route participation in week 8, had 3 targets in that game. Week 9 was inactive, and all indications were it was off-field stuff. I don't know that we ever got I don't know if you heard more than I did about what the actual story was there, but it was he was not he was inactive because of off-field stuff. And here's the
you didn't hear?
No, did you?
He no call, no showed on Saturday, and then showed up on Sunday in his pajamas.
Oh shit!
After they game planned for him.
Oops. I just accidentally clicked on a video. Okay, maybe I did hear that. Now that you say it, it does sound familiar. So maybe I did read that report about. Yeah, so that is kind of insane. So I don't know. So the video I just clicked on was actually I was going to read what it said. So it's head coach Zach Taylor in the post game presser last week, and this is of course in the Coach Speak Index Discord. Said Jermaine Burton was a big part of the game plan for today's game. People were saying a lot of positive things about him early in the week. That was all true. Then late in the week, we just got to handle all of our business the right way. And I guess Adam just gave you the indication of what happened there. Said it was a difficult decision to make him inactive, but it was absolutely the right decision with all the information we had. He is a guy who's going to have, I think, a really good career here, and we're going to support him, and he wants to help us win and do things the right way. Today was just a necessary step we had to make, but we're going to get him back in the fold and keep moving along and becoming a pro. And there's a lot of things to love about Jermaine. So his best days are in front of him. We're going to make sure that he achieves that. Let's see. I thought there was maybe more later on. But yeah, he said at some point this week that we expect him to play this week and practice this week and play on Thursday. I'm not seeing that right now, but I think indications are that they are expecting him to play tonight. People also, there were pictures of him at the casino playing slot games after, like the day after. So I don't know what's going on with Jermaine Burton. I think my stance as of right now is I'm going to play a lot of Jermaine Burton if he's active, but I'm going to obviously wait until inactives are in to see that. I don't know. How are you handling the Jermaine Burton situation?
So obviously there's it's a massive wild card. If he's inactive, obviously then he's inactive. But if he's in, it's a really big wild card because we haven't seen him in a big role yet this year, but we did see his biggest role of the season 2 games ago. You had Burrow also saying like this guy needs to play more. You have a clear opportunity for him with no real wide receiver behind Jamar Chase when Higgins is out. So all of that's working in his favor. Talent is there. That's never been a question with this guy. So there is all of that. And then, but it's, how are they going to use him in this game? Logically, to me, I think he has a big role. Like, you saw the role increase. You had Burrow say what he said. You have the team obviously pissed off with what happened last week because they planned on using him. It doesn't make a lot of sense logically to like activate him and then punish him by not playing him when you're also punishing yourself in a divisional game by not playing your second best receiver. Like, I think him being inactive last week was the punishment. And now you probably just get back to what you wanted to do and you put him on the field. So I think it creates a really interesting situation because the industry will probably kind of project like the median outcome, which is somewhere between he plays a bunch and he barely plays, and is almost absolutely not correct. Like, he's probably either not going to play a lot or he is going to play a lot. He's probably not going to like sort of play. So that's something to keep an eye on. Right now, I think the projection that I used when I ran my stuff was too low. I got to like 12% of him. Ownership projections only at like 6 or 7%. That number almost definitely comes up also as projections throughout the industry adjust. So, the way I got to him right now, I think take with a grain of salt. I think I'll have more, most likely, if he's in by lock, assuming that projected ownership isn't insane. Like, if you were to get like, a 40% projection on somebody that like could just not actually have a role, then that changes things. But assuming it's some sort of like reasonable, 15, 20% projection at 2,200 for a guy that I think could be the Bengals wide receiver 2 today, I absolutely would like to take my chances on that.
It's really tough right now because there are multiple of the like biggest projection sources around the industry that currently have him for a 0. Like, they just have him as not playing tonight. And obviously if he is active, those sources are going to change, and that's going to obviously affect ownership projections. The ownership projection, the only place that I see any kind of ownership projection for him right now is in the single digits. And I'm assuming when I say I really like Jermaine Burton, I'm going to be well over the field. That's kind of assuming single digit ownership. If he does come in at, 20%, suddenly I'm like, all right, I still think I kind of like that, but not like, I'm not like in love with it. It'd be like, I'll probably come in over the field, but I don't feel that strongly about it. If he does come in single digits, then I'm going to be like, I'll go for 35%. Like I just will have a lot of Jermaine Burton in that scenario. But I think you laid it out well. It's like we don't really know. I'm assuming if he's active, the punishment is over and he's going to play. The coaches have said that they plan on him playing this week. But yeah, it's a mess because yeah, they're probably pissed. Like, I mean, if I were a coach, I'd be pissed that the player who was going to be a big part of my game plan just kind of no-showed on the team. But I don't know. He's talented. Hope they probably want to get him going. They don't want it to be a completely sunk cost. So kind of up in the air. But yeah, if he comes in low owned, I'm going to be taking a lot of shots on Jermaine Burton. If he comes in high owned, then like you said, it'll be a fade if he's 40%, obviously.
I think it'll be really interesting to see what the industry does with projections. Like I said, I don't really expect most places to take a stand. This to me is just one of those situations where, a lot of times I think in 2024 DFS, you don't get a huge advantage. Most people don't get a huge advantage by like doing your own projections because projection sites are really good. But this is one of those situations where I think that the incentive of projection sites is actually kind of not in line with actually being like correct on somebody like Burton. There's more incentive for, if you have a bunch of people paying you money for projections, there's more incentive for you to kind of just say like, yeah, okay, I'm going to give Jermaine Burton 6 fantasy points. It's not going to make all of my subscribers jam him. It's not going to make none of them play him. And no matter what happens, somebody, people that sub to my site, some people that sub to my site will be happy. Whereas if you actually say like, it's much more likely that he gets either 2 or 9 fantasy points. If you choose 9, you're gonna have a lot of pissed off people if he barely plays. And if you choose 2, you're gonna have a lot of pissed off people if he does play a lot. So this is a situation where more than most, I think you actually want to think this through for yourself. And probably, again, like maybe I'm wrong and sites actually do take a stand, but pay attention to whatever site you're using, what they do, because there's a pretty good chance that you actually believe that it's either that his projection should be higher or lower for a good reason.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. We've talked about this, like the dilemma that projection sources have when they're doing their projections of like, you don't want to be way wrong, but obviously like the mid-lane projection is not like the reality. It's like there's a wide range of outcomes. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, Sean said he had Jarrett Monday and needed Miller. I think that I flipped from Miller to Jarrett as my favorite. I went back and forth. Those two of my like the Tampa Bay receivers who were coming in at low ownership. That was such a tough spot. But really, Miller just had the one catch for a touchdown, I think. So that's just a tough break. Trenton Irwin, Kendrick Pryor. I looked at Kendrick Pryor. He was a little bit involved last weekend, and he was throughout the game. But I'm kind of thinking that if Burton is active, he probably doesn't play a ton. So I don't think he's going to be a big priority for me. Trenton Irwin's sort of interesting just in the sense that he, like earlier in the year, had pretty strong role. Like they were targeting him in the end zone a lot early in the year. But more recently, and I think the more recent games are a better, sample to use, just one target each of the past 2 weeks, even with T. Higgins out, as I was referring to early in the year. Strong route participation, saw a ton of end zone targets. But it's a tough situation to read. Again, last week though, I think is our best sample, the most recent, and he just did not get a ton of usage. In the flex, we have Trenton Irwin coming in at 6% ownership at 1,200. I don't know. I think that seems fine. What do you think of Trenton Irwin at 6%?
Yeah, I think like that 5 to 10% range is fine. In the lineups that I built before the show, I think I have more Irwin than I will by lock. I had like 15%, but just looking at the projection that I used on him, I think it's just like I think my Burton one is low. I think the Irwin one is high. So I do expect that to come down. I expect Burton to go up, but yeah, I mean, he at least at times in his career has had a role on this team. It hasn't been recently. And obviously, if Burton is active, then it becomes less likely that today's the day he has a role. But he is only 1,200. We have seen him have success in the past. As long as he's low owned, fine. And he will be a very obvious guy to look to potentially as a Burton pivot. If let's say the industry doesn't hedge their bets on Burton and everybody's just projecting him as the wide receiver too, which is obviously an extreme example. And then he's getting, 60% ownership at 2,200 in that case, then Irwin's like a natural pivot guy at 5%, where you're just like, well, what if the field's completely wrong and Irwin steps up this week? But assuming that isn't the case, I think he's just another one of many, like we said, like sub $2,500 guys that you can make the case for like, yeah, they probably step on the field and they have some sort of role, but it's not like a clear cut thing.
Yeah. And I'm just pointing out end zone targets on the year, 5 for Yoshivas, 5 for Irwin. They lead the team still, and just early on, for whatever reason, they were targeting Irwin a ton. Matthew Bellman asks, he says, you think Burton's sort of play and is definitely not in the cards, excluding last week as stretch to call him the Bengals wide receiver too, as they've had issues with him the entire time he's been there. So I think when we say like sort of playing means like, I don't think he's going to play 3 snaps. I don't think he's going to be like sort of playing in the sense that he's cutting down from his previous role. But I think probably projecting for his role in week 8 is probably good, which is like 42.5% route participation. Like, yeah, he was already sort of playing. I guess I don't think that they're going to, if they plan on playing him, I don't think they're going to punish him. I think is sort of where we're coming down on, which doesn't mean 90% route participation, because he's never been a 90% route participation guy. But I think like if they were planning on playing him, like upping it to 50% route participation, my guess is that is where they would go. Is that kind of how you're feeling also?
Yeah, like when I say that I don't think they're going to sort of play him, like this season, prior to week 8, his highest route participation was just below 20%. I don't think you're going to get like, and then week 8, he was at 42.5. I don't think you're going to get like 30% route participation this week. I don't think it's going to be, the Bengals are going to be like, well, we were going to use him 60% of the time, but then he skipped everything, so we're just going to cut that in half. Like, I think they either just say, screw this guy, he's back to being like a sub 20% route guy, or last week was last week, we handled it, and now he's going to go have the role that we envisioned in week 9. I don't think that they just like cut it down the middle, because that would just make no sense. And as far as him being the wide receiver too, I obviously don't mean that like he has been the wide receiver too in terms of usage or anything. He's the wide receiver too from a talent standpoint. He is a better wide receiver. He's more talented than anybody on this team, anybody healthy on this team other than Jamar Chase. Like, this is a first round pick that fell to the 3rd round because of exactly what we're seeing from an off the field standpoint. There's never been questions about his talent. I don't think there's anybody that thinks Andre Yoshivas is better at football than at being a wide receiver than Jermaine Burton from a talent standpoint.
Yeah. So it's good clarification. So I'm glad Bellman asked that question. But yeah, I guess we're saying like, it's not that I think he's going to suddenly be a full-time player. It's just that I don't think that I don't think he's going to lose playing time due to punishment, or he's either going to lose all of his playing time due to punishment or none of it. I guess not. Like, I don't think he's going to lose some of his playing time as a punishment is, I think, what we're trying to say.
Yeah, like I think they're either going to give him the role that they were going to use him last week, which I thought was going to be big. Like, he was somebody that I planned on taking a very big stand on last Sunday prior to him being inactive. For the same reason, basically, that we're talking about. The industry was projecting him to have like a bigger role than usual, but usual for him is like sub 20%. And I don't think that it's just going to be like, oh, well, now he runs 30% of routes. I think it's like he is either a guy for them or he is not. And I don't really think there's a big middle ground there.
Yep. Well said.
And yes, no, he is. He was a first round grade talent wise.
Yeah. Anybody else? Are you getting to any Kendrick Pryor? I think if Burton is active, I'm just not going to play any Kendrick Pryor. I would guess he's probably going to be inactive in that scenario. I don't know. What do you?
Yeah, he showed up like 5% for me, but I barely have any projection on him or anything. I think it was just mixing him in as a $200 guy, but again, could just not even be active.
And then the other side of the game, a little bit more straightforward. Zay Flowers, the top projection for Baltimore. He's 9,600, coming in at in the flex, 34% ownership. In the captain spot, Zay Flowers coming in at 8% ownership. As far as schedule adjusted stuff for Zay Flowers here, I'll pull it up. 4 wide receivers overall. Slightly below average matchup, 4 wide receivers overall. And then we were being asked about the specific matchup for Zay Flowers. Let's take a look. Where does he run his routes? Like, how much is he in the slot? 63% out wide, 36% from the slot for Zay Flowers, which... Was there any big difference there in terms of schedule adjusted? Let's see. Slightly better, I guess, out wide than from the slot, but slightly positive matchup for both. I don't know. What are your thoughts on Zay Flowers?
I think he looks fine here. 9,600, decent price tag. They move him around. Saw the question come up earlier about him being in the slot. Like 35% of his routes have been in the slot this year. 65% have been outside. Fantasy Points has a very good coverage rate overall, which I think I saw somebody mention the single high usage from the Bengals being good for Flowers. Yeah, I mean, I think he looks fine here as far as how much I'd be getting to him if the slate started right now. I have him from a leverage standpoint going pretty over-owned at flex with 27% projected ownership, and then under-owned at captain with only 7.5% projected ownership. As far as the lineups that I actually would have been playing, looks like I would have him at captain at about 10%, so a little bit over the field there. And then at flex, about 35%, so a little bit over the field there too, even though I think he's going a little bit over-owned. Still just showing up a lot, probably also because I'm over the field on Lamar. So obviously that pulls Flowers along a little bit too.
Yeah. We had the question earlier. LeBrier was asking about Mike Hilton returning, and he wasn't there for the last game when Zay Flowers went off. And then, Jake responded. LeBrier said, for what it's worth, Flowers has crushed single high, which Cincinnati plays a lot of, and I'm never concerned with wide receiver cornerback matchups unless it's Patrick Surtain. I think I'm not concerned about the matchup, I guess, is the takeaway there.
I always just view it like if the team's missing their starting corners, then it's a better matchup than if they're in. But with very few exceptions, I don't really care.
Yep.
Especially in this case where like it is somebody like Flowers that moves around. Usually if I do care, it would be, this guy runs 100% of his routes from the slot, and this lockdown corner is just going to be on him every single time. Like that's not going to be the case here.
Rashad Bateman, 5,800. He's kind of he's so boom bust that, there's a good chance that he's just a huge bust. He might go off, have a big game here. Pretty strong usage on the year, but let's see, getting like 3 or 4 targets most games, not super used, but then he can have big games. The ownership kind of coming in where I like it. He's getting sub 20%, but 19%. Like it's kind of, I don't think I'm taking any major stand there. Actually, I thought about him as my biggest fade, but I just can't do it. I think it's just 19% feels about right for Rashad Bateman. What do you think?
Yeah, I have like 23% right now, and that was at flex, and that was with him projected for like 13%. So like we were saying earlier with whoever it was that I was saying about earlier, if ownership ends up coming in closer to the number that you have, I would also just be losing a little bit of Bateman there. Obviously there are question marks about exactly how this offense is going to look with Deontay Johnson getting more involved and all of that. But Bateman, I think, should still pretty clearly have a role. 5,800 is not cheap, but for a big play guy, it's also not super expensive. There's just going to be a lot of volatility in his production, but that's not a negative thing in DFS tournaments. Like, certainly not somebody I think I'd be looking at in cash games, but very high standard deviation guy that, if he catches a 50-yard touchdown, he's probably going to be optimal at 5,800. If he doesn't, he's probably not.
All offseason, the coaches were like, we think he's a star receiver. We think he's going to break out this year. Mark Andrews is saying, like, everybody talks so much about Rashad Bateman. I draft a lot of him in best ball as a result, and I'm feeling good about that with Rashad Bateman, one of my few good calls. Now we have Deontay Johnson coming in, and my thought had been when they made the trade that, like, okay, now I guess Rashad Bateman goes to 0. It's going to be Deontay Johnson as a wide receiver too, because I think he has a better career than Rashad Bateman. None of the coach speak seems to indicate that. It all seems to be like, Deontay Johnson, great depth piece for us, which kind of shocked me to hear them talk about him like he's kind of sounds like he's going to be playing behind Rashad Bateman. I'm not sure if I buy it, but regardless, for this game, he's only been, I think he's had 2 practices with the team. I think I saw Tom Strachan tweet that out earlier. I'm not expecting much from Deontay Johnson. So I think he's probably going to be, again, like I want to fade it. I want the field to play a ton of Deontay Johnson at 4,800 to make me feel more comfortable fading it. But we're not really seeing that coming in at 11% here at Roto-Grant. I think it's a little bit higher than 11% elsewhere. To me, that kind of feels right. Like it kind of encapsulates the range of outcomes where he's most likely going to not do a ton because he's probably not going to play a lot. But then also he's a really good receiver. Maybe they just decide to get him the ball more. I don't know. What are you doing with Deontay Johnson?
I'm not really getting to him. 4,800, again, not a super cheap price tag. His ownership is projected close enough to Bateman right now. Like I said, I have Johnson at 12%. I have Bateman projected at like 13, in which case I just want to find that $1,000 for Bateman more often. The short week on top of, the limited practice time last week, obviously isn't favorable for Johnson making like a big jump in terms of playing time this week, no matter what the Ravens' ultimate plan for him is, whether it's, being behind Bateman or not. I think the strongest case probably you could make for Deontay Johnson is that with Isaiah likely out, maybe you do see less 12 personnel this week and you do see more 3 wide receiver sets. But how much does that even matter if he doesn't know the playbook? Like, he ran 6 routes last week, and now you have a Thursday night game. It's just hard to think that he's going to have like a massive role here. And he's somebody that, for me to want to go to him on this slate, I would need to really see low ownership to take on what I think is a lot of risk.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Like, it would be, if you were coming at 3%, then I'd be like, you know what? I'm willing to roll it out there and just think that, like, he's a veteran receiver. They're going to give him a lot of work. But yeah, as Tom Strachan pointed out on Twitter, just 2 practices with Lamar Jackson so far. So even though he's been on the team a little bit longer, like, just, it's a short week. They haven't had a ton of time to get him up with the offense. The ownership that he's getting, to me, feels fine. Sounds like you think it's just a little bit high, but like, obviously 11%, not crazy high. I don't know. There's a good chance I come in a little bit underweight to 11%, but I don't really think that it's too far off from where it should be. You get into any Nelson Aguilar, 3,000. Not generally. I think he's been a fade for me on showdown slates. Let's see.
I only have like 5%.
That seems about right. Where is it coming in? Let's see. In the flex, Aguilar coming in 7%, so you're coming in a little bit light. Feels right to me. Don't think he's that good. You look at his game logs. Historically, he just doesn't really have spike weeks. Just like not somebody who does a ton, and he's not 200. So yeah. CWS Ken Deontay run block. I have not looked up.
PFF has him as fine.
Okay.
They have like a 59 grade on him, which is similar to Aguilar.
Okay.
Better than Bateman, better than Flowers.
Eli Case says, let's say you had 1 spot left. Would you rather take Bateman or Tucker? I mean, it depends on the rest of your lineup. Probably more often I'd take Tucker, but I don't know. Don't feel that strongly about it.
Yeah, I mean, I have more Bateman, but again, like you said, it depends on the rest of your lineup. I also have a lot of Lamar. I have identical projections right now for both of them, so it really just comes down to what works better with your lineup and or what's less likely to be duped because it doesn't work well with your lineup, which is always the fun part of Showdown.
Good point. Anything else from wide receivers?
Yeah, I think Choke Oldham probably has it right. Tucker small field and Bateman large field. You have, not that Tucker doesn't have volatility, especially this year since he's not making kicks, but Bateman is like we said, just you're kind of more of a big play guy that either gets there in a big way or doesn't, whereas Tucker is more likely to not kill you.
Yeah. All right. Move on to tight ends. And it's again a mess. We have Isaiah likely out for the Ravens. We have Eric Hall out for the Bengals. Both kind of significant. So it becomes a mess. Mark Andrews, to me, is going to look pretty great. I assume he's going to take up most of that work that is left behind from Isaiah likely. He is 4,200, coming in at 31% projected ownership in the flex. In the captain spot, Mark Andrews coming in at 9% projected ownership. Adam, I'm super into Mark Andrews tonight. I'm curious if you feel the same way.
Yeah, I think he looks pretty good. I only have 2% at captain, but I'm right around the field with like 39% at flex. Good price tag at 4,200. You've seen him come on lately anyway, which I think helps to alleviate the concerns that people had at the beginning of the year of like, did this guy just forget to play football in the offseason? Did the car accident take away all of his football playing abilities? You've seen him come on and, just kind of return to being a good tight end anyway, good pass catcher anyway. Now, not having likely just lowers some of the volatility. Obviously, there's still going to be a ton of volatility in a single game sample, but you just lose the risk of, him losing playing time to likely in any given game or whatever. So it does make him look better. He obviously just looks really good to me at 4,200.
Yeah, it's just like, I feel like we have, without Isaiah likely, we're more likely to just see Mark Andrews in the Mark Andrews role from last year, and he's too cheap for that role. So to me, and he's not getting crazy high ownership. So I like it just because we're not seeing like the ownership bump to 60%. Like people are assuming that he's Mark Andrews is back. So as long as he's at 30%, to me, I'm going to be pretty well over the field, I think, on Mark Andrews. But hard to say. Charlie Kolar then, with Isaiah likely out, I try to do a little bit of like looking at last year, Adam, to figure out like how much of a roll bump is he going to get, and it's kind of a mess. So I'll read what I found and kind of So on the season right now, Charlie Kolar, 9 targets on 6.7% route participation in 9 games. So 1 target per game so far this year. As I said, Kolar is likely to benefit from Likely's absence, but possibly not by much, judging by last year. Likely played all 19 games for the Ravens last year. But Kolar you saw a split with Mark Andrews in and Mark Andrews out. So Kolar played 8 games with Mark Andrews active and saw just 1 target on 6 total routes in those games. If you remove week 18 because the starters sat and or were only played part of the game, so he had a big role in week 18. If you remove week 18, Kolar played 7 games without Mark Andrews, but with Isaiah Likely, he saw 5 targets in 7 games on 14.6% route participation. The role has been better this year when both Andrews and Likely are active. So like, I think he could have a better role than the last year when he saw less than 1 target per game without Mark Andrews. This year, he has 6 first read targets and 1 end zone targets, which he caught for a touchdown so far this year. So I think he has just like generally a better role this year than last year, but I don't think that we can expect him to suddenly play like 40% of snaps and like step in and be the Mark Andrews necessarily. But it's kind of unclear. So that's based on last year. I'm not expecting him to like move up into the split with Mark Andrews role. But I could be totally wrong about that. I don't know. What are you seeing with? And I guess it's going to come down to ownership. So actually, before you answer, let me read what the ownership is here. Maybe you have it different. But in the flex, Roto Grinders has Charlie Kolar coming in at 18% ownership. So what are you doing with Kolar?
I have a lot of him right now.
Okay.
I had him projected for like 14% ownership in the flex when I ran my stuff. I got to 37% at 600. I agree with everything you said from a playing time standpoint, that I think he plays more with Likely out than he would have played with Likely in. I don't think he just steps into the Likely role where it's still a ton of 12 personnel and he's out there running routes like constantly. But so I think he has a bigger role. But the thing that I like is that they've clearly wanted to get the ball in his hands when he's been on the field so far this year. He leads the team in targets per route run by like a massive margin, which again, he's run 20 routes, but he has 9 targets. And you mentioned the first read stuff. I like, like I said, like when he's on the field, they've looked to get the ball in his hands. Now I'm not saying that over a larger sample, they continue to just make him the first read every time he runs a route, but this isn't somebody that like when he's been on the field is just out there to block and they're not looking to get him the ball. And at $600, you don't need them to be getting him the ball a ton, especially, on this slate where you do have Chase, Henry, Lamar, Burrow, to pay for. You have, Chase Brown at 9K. I think that he looks good at $600 and the ownership isn't high enough to be a problem for me.
Okay. Yeah, it's one that I struggle with because it's like, well, you just look at last year, like he had a bigger role, but it wasn't that big of a role, but also his base role has grown this year where it's like he is, like you say, like better targets per route run. So it's with the better base role, you give him the same kind of, relative bump. Like he's going to look pretty good at 600. So I think it makes sense to get a good amount there. It's also tough because we have so much value on the slate where to me, 18% ownership seems maybe a little bit low. So maybe I'll tail you on that and be a little bit above weight there. I don't think I'm going to get to like over 30% necessarily, but maybe 25%.
Yeah, and this is another one where like the ownership projection I had was between 13 and 14%. If you go to your 18%, I lose a little bit, I'm sure. I have his optimal rate between 15 and 16% at flex.
Okay, nice. Yeah, so looks pretty good, but I guess I would caution anybody who's like, oh, Charlie Kolar, now he's going to step into the Mark Andrews role, or whatever you consider the tight end 2 role. I wouldn't expect that necessarily.
And one other thing to keep in mind with him too is like he was a solid pass catcher in college. Like he was somebody when they drafted him, kind of like when they drafted Likely, it was a later draft pick, but you could see how he potentially, blossoms into a good pass catching tight end. Then he got hurt his rookie year, missed a lot of that season, and then you had Likely step up. So this is somebody that like has had that underlying talent and hasn't really been needed on this team. So it's a little bit different too when you think about how they might use him or his range of outcomes. This isn't somebody that coming out of college was like, oh, he has potential, and then hasn't been getting playing time because necessarily he didn't live up to his potential or the Ravens don't think he can do it. He hasn't been getting playing time because Isaiah Likely ended up being really good and is playing ahead of him along with Andrews.
Yeah, no, that is a really, really good note. I also, This year, I've more often when I look up like when backup tight ends become relevant, I've been looking them up, and I didn't realize that like every tight end in the NFL is 6'6" or taller. Like he is 6'6", so that's why I say that. I'm exaggerating, but it kind of feels like every time I look up a tight end, I'm like, holy shit, I didn't realize that they're all so gigantic. I thought like Mo Alley Cox was an outlier, but no, they're all pretty gigantic. Would make sense for him to be an end zone target, as we saw. He's already had an end zone target, so that helps as well. Looks good. I don't think we have any other tight ends, at least as of right now. I don't think there's any other tight ends I plan on playing from the Ravens. The Bengals side also interesting. So again, no Eric All, so you'd expect kind of everybody to get a little bit of a bump. Mike Gesicki projects the best. He has had a pretty strong role in recent weeks. Gesicki also interesting from a schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed perspective, because so it is a fine matchup. Yeah, kind of a slightly above average matchup for tight ends. And I started talking with Scott Barrett about this last night because I thought it was interesting. One of the bigger splits here between inline tight ends gain 2.9 points, split out 2.4 points. And so I got into like, what does that mean when like he runs mostly from the slot, and ultimately came away with, let's just consider him a slot receiver. And if you want to consider Mike Gesicki a slot receiver, suddenly it looks like a great matchup, second best matchup for slot receivers against Baltimore. So I think it's a pretty strong matchup for Mike Gesicki. I don't know if that's exactly the right way to think about it. That kind of like boggles my mind. Like, can you just treat him as a slot receiver instead of a tight end? What do you think?
I think the issue is that he's going to be less talented than most receivers.
True. Yeah. But still, like, he's decent. I don't know. What do you think of? So are you not that interested? Let's see. Gesicki coming in at 25% ownership in the flex. He's probably getting some captain ownership. 4% ownership at captain. I don't have any huge issue with it. The usage has been pretty good recently. Sounds like you're maybe less inclined to play him.
I think he's fine. I have like 19% at flex, 3% at captain. I don't love the price tag, but we have seen him more involved. I had the really big Twitter thread with Drew about him the other day. You've seen him take on a bigger role without T. Higgins in terms of route participation, in terms of targets. It still hasn't been a huge role though. So I think that's the thing to keep in mind, especially coming off of last week where he did have, a top 0.5 or 1 or top 99, top 1% outcome in that game, going for 100 yards and two touchdowns. A bigger role for him doesn't mean a huge role. Like, this is somebody that when Higgins has been in this year is getting target shares of like 5-6%. Yeah. And then with Higgins out, with the exception of one game where he had a massive target share, he's been like, 14, 15, 16%. So it's a much bigger role relative to what he's been getting when T. Higgins is in, but it's still not him going out there and being like Trey McBride as far as getting targets or something like that. So I think that's important to keep in mind when you have him, on the main slate last week, he was 3,100. That's like a really cheap price tag for somebody getting that sort of role. Whereas now he's 6,600. Like, he's more expensive than Rashad Bateman. He's legitimate. He's legitimately priced. He's $2,400 more than Mark Andrews for a guy that probably is going to get like a 15-16% target share. So I think that he's fine. Like, he clearly has a bigger role without Higgins, but I think that if anything, he's overpriced, and you're not getting that same sort of value today that you were on Sunday.
Angry Minpin says, Adam clearly doesn't watch football. Has he seen Gesicki's gritty? I mean, you said that Gesicki is not as talented as tight ends, and clearly that comes through, and Gesicki's gritty is not as good as a wide receiver's gritty. So I think that's an indication that Adam does watch ball. Let's see. What was I going to say? One additional. So over the past 2 weeks, 14 total targets on 16.5% route participation. Eric All being out does help him a little bit. So maybe the role gets a little bit better because Eric All was actually like pretty involved on the season. 21 targets, 28.1% route participation. So a little bit of a benefit there. I don't know. I think at 6,600. I have no real issue at. He's coming in sub 30% ownership at Roto Grinders. How much are you getting to about
for Gesicki?
Yeah,
like 19% flex, 3% captain.
Okay, so a little bit underweight to the field. Yeah, that seems fine to me. I could see myself getting to like, I think I'll probably get to where the field is, but I don't know. I haven't come up with a lot of places to fade so far, so maybe it does end up coming in a little bit light. Outside of Gesicki, we have still kind of a mess without Eric All there in Cincinnati. Drew Sample, Tanner Hudson, and Tanner McLaughlin. I don't think I'm blowing to any Tanner McLaughlin, but Drew Sample and Tanner Hudson, both kind of interesting to me. I think I'm more interested in Tanner Hudson. I think he's coming in at lower ownership. Let's see. So Drew Sample coming in 14% here. Tanner Hudson 11%. Tanner Hudson 1,600. Drew Sample 2,600. Let's see. I don't know. It's a tricky situation. What are you doing with the Bengals tight ends?
I'm getting to a pretty good amount of Hudson at 1,600. I have like 24%. Had him projected for like 12% when I ran my stuff. So again, if that ends up coming in a little bit higher ownership wise, then I'll lose some. But I do like him here. We saw him run like 8 routes last week. I think all ran 9. I think he steps in. I think they continue to split time between their tight ends, at least to some extent. But the other thing that I like about Hudson is, not that it's the biggest sample, but has gotten more targets per route run than Sample or any of the other tight ends this year. Also, if you go back to last year where he ran the most tight end routes on the team with 210, he once again led the team in targets per route run ahead of Drew Sample. So, I think that Hudson's shown the ability when he does run routes to actually get some targets and earn targets. He's cheap. The big question is, exactly how involved is he? What is the gap between Drew Sample's route participation and Tanner Hudson's? But you're getting an ownership, or you're getting a salary discount. The ownership is projected to be pretty similar. And again, I just think that Hudson's shown the ability to earn targets more than Sample. As long as he is running a similar amount of routes, he's going to me, look better.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I'm pulling this up because not EOM bringing up that Gesicki and all play different roles. I mean, that is true. Like as you can see here, Gesicki 66% from the slot on the year. Eric All just 20% from the slot. He's run a lot more inline, as has Drew Sample. So I guess you could argue that Drew Sample. So looking at this, maybe Tanner Hudson and Drew Sample, maybe Sample benefits more from Eric All being out, but they also might just kind of change the way they run the offense. So I don't want to read too much into that. Tanner Hudson to me stood out as the better. Just looking at, they project about the same. Tanner Hudson $1,000 cheaper and getting less ownership. I don't know how much you get into of Drew Sample. Did you say?
No, I didn't, but not much. So right now I was getting like 4% Sample at flex, 24% Hudson. And basically what you're seeing happen there, I think, is what I was just saying. I had them projected for similar ownership, both around 12%. So like 24% in the aggregate projected ownership to those guys. And then I'm playing like 28% combined. So I'm pretty much playing them at the same rate as the field. But because I think that they are very similar plays, Hudson's cheaper and the ownership's the same, I'm basically just playing a lot of Hudson in place of Sample. If ownership were to change where suddenly Hudson's like 16% and Sample's 8%, then you probably see it kind of flatten back out for me where I have like 14% a piece or something like that.
Yeah. See, so I have the same read as you, and that was kind of my plan also. Does this give you any pause, like just looking at how much like Hudson seems to be playing more of the Gesicki role, like just in terms of like where they're lining up, whereas Drew Sample and Eric All playing more from running inline. So I think maybe that's why some places have Drew Sample projected better than Tanner Hudson, maybe expecting him to just take on that Eric All workload. I don't know, that it concerns me a little bit. It gives me a little bit of pause for that approach. I came in before looking at this, I was thinking the exact same thing as you, and now I'm like, I don't know if I want to lean into it or not. What do you think?
I mean, I would rather it not be the case, but also when you're talking about guys this cheap, I generally just am not going to care that much.
Yeah.
Like if they just want another big body to go out there and be a pass catching threat, I think Hudson is going to be the answer. Like I think he's going to play a bigger role than he has. I don't think he's going to just like step in and be Eric All.
Right. I think Drew Sample he's more likely to just take that Eric All role maybe than Tanner Hudson is, but I don't really know by how much. I think both are fine, like better than your typical backup tight end, I would say. Like, we talk about I'll play a little bit and maybe see an end zone target if he scores a touchdown you want him. I think that they all of the backup tight ends on this slate have more upside than just like they could score a random touchdown, I think. So I kind of like all of the backup tight ends.
And Hudson last season, 28% inline route percentage compared to 56.5% for Sample. So you saw, Sample still primarily be the inline guy last year, but still Hudson be utilized at least somewhat in that role.
That's a good note. Yeah. Alan S says, how many tight ends from the same lineup? You mean overall? Sorry, I was going to say same team. If I were hand building, I'd probably limit myself to 2, but I'm not going to set a rule. I don't think. Totally fine getting more than 2 if you're including all the tight ends on the side. Like, if you want to play Gesicki and Tanner Hudson and Mark Andrews, I have no issue with that. Any disagreement, Adam?
Nope.
Okay. Let's see. I don't think there's anything else from tight ends. So kickers and defenses, Justin Tucker, 13.5%. Evan McPherson, a little bit lower, 13%. Bengals defense, 11%. Ravens defense, 16%. So a little bit light overall, which makes sense. Honestly, we're expecting a lot of scoring. Are you getting well over the field on any of these?
I was still just looking at Bengals tight end stuff.
Okay.
I'm getting to not a lot. 12% Ravens in the flex, like 1% Bengals. So a lot less defense than I typically play.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. Like, this isn't the best defense slate. Obviously things go weird all the time in football. So 1% seems low. If you're running a 150 set, I'd want to have more than that. But yeah, I think getting lower than usual ownership makes sense for these defenses. At least the kickers feel a little bit low to me. Justin Tucker and Evan McPherson both under 14%. I probably try and get above that. I don't know. What do you think?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Kickers, 14%. Do you want to get higher?
I have Tucker projected for like 21%, optimal rate at like 18%. I have McPherson projected for like 17%, optimal percentage at 12. So I think they're both going a little bit over-owned. I mentioned earlier that I was getting like more Bateman than Tucker. Tucker showing up for me like 11% of the time, McPherson like 6%. So again, less kickers than I usually get to, but given the way that I have their ownership projected right now, at least I think that makes sense, where they're guys that I do just have projected to go over-owned. I have guys that are similarly priced projected to be under-owned. So I'm just playing more of those guys.
Okay. CW asks, how chalky do we expect Mark Andrews to be a captain? He's projected for about 9%. I think that seems about right to me.
Yeah, I have like 5.
That's what you're projecting for? Like, that's where the field. Interesting. Okay.
I think at like 4.5.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm like 9% seems good to me. Like, if the field's at 9%, I'll be right there. Like, but that is giving him like his role from last year, essentially, which is an assumption that I'm making is he's just going to step in and have an awesome role. Could be wrong. Maybe Charlie Kolar more involved. Yeah, kind of hard to say, but I like it. I think Andrews is going to be a big part of my lineups, both at captain and at flex. Anything else that you have coming up, Adam? I think that does it for the show. Do you have any content coming up the rest of the weekend? Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me using the links in the description below. NFL Dub Club. I'll have my data up tonight for this showdown slate. I'll have stuff up for Sunday. I'll have my game-by-game notes up for Sunday as well. If you want access to Yuta, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, and myself, we have a bunch of instructional DFS videos up on Endgame Syndicate. We're also active in the Discord over there. Also on the Endgame channel. Earlier today, Nerdy, Brick, and Davis Maddock talked about Battle Royales on Underdog using Nerdy's sim tools. So check that out if you're playing those.
Very cool. Yeah, check that out. Make sure you are subscribed to both of our channels. We're trying to grow them. The Flannelverse Endgame Syndicate, both new this year YouTube channel. So we would appreciate any support you guys can show for us by liking, subscribing, turn on notifications if you want to get alerts when we go live. Comment. All of that is very helpful for the YouTube algorithm. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Adam, and apologies for keeping you an hour and 20 minutes after we went late. Anyway, I'll be back tonight, 90 minutes prior to the game, to break down once we have inactives. Thanks, everybody, and we will catch you later.